They said I was broke anyway. My son laughed when I told him no, and the sound of it was so light, so easy, like he'd brushed dust off his shoulder, not his mother off his conscience. I can still hear that laugh sometimes, when the bakery downstairs opens before dawn and the metal shutters rattle. It has the same sharp edge, the same careless rhythm. I am 74 now, and I live above that bakery, in a small apartment that smells of yeast and cinnamon and something that almost feels like safety. But that laugh, his laugh, was the moment I realized I had been quietly disappearing for years, dissolving into a figure who made soups and phone calls and polite excuses for everyone else's comfort. When he said those words, I saw the distance between us measured not in miles, but in respect that had thinned to nothing. I wasn't always a woman who said no. Most of my life was a long yes. Yes to overtime shifts at the hospital when the kids were little. Yes to the mortgage when my husband's back gave out and he couldn't work. Yes to tuition checks, moving boxes, late-night phone calls that started with, "Mom, could you just—" That yes built their futures. I thought it would build gratitude too, or at least recognition. Instead, it built an expectation so solid that when I finally hesitated, even for a second, it sounded to my son like betrayal. He had called me that morning about a loan for a new business, something with property development, something promising. His tone was confident, impatient, the way men sound when they are used to being agreed with. When I told him I'd rather not co-sign anything, that I was trying to keep my finances simple, there was a pause. Then that laugh, small and cutting. "You're broke anyway, Mom," he said. "Don't act like you've got something to lose." He said it like a joke, but I heard the truth behind it. The way he saw me. The assumption that I had nothing left but sentiment. I didn't argue. I just sat at my kitchen table with the phone pressed to my ear and looked at the stack of envelopes I'd been sorting that morning. My pension statements, my small investments, the careful arithmetic of a woman who has learned that security must be silent to survive. He didn't know about any of it. I'd never thought it necessary to tell him, maybe because I'd believed that dignity required privacy, or maybe because part of me still liked the idea of being underestimated. It gave me room to breathe. But that morning, something in me shifted. It wasn't anger yet, more like the slow heat that rises from a pot before it boils. After we hung up, I sat for a long time in the stillness that follows humiliation. The air in the apartment felt thick, scented with yesterday's coffee grounds. I thought about how, over the years, his voice had changed when he spoke to me, how the warmth had drained out slowly, replaced by a tone that was efficient, managerial, as if I were a small business he occasionally audited. He loved the story of himself as the successful son, the self-made man, the provider. And in that story, I was background texture. The retired nurse who lived comfortably enough, the mother who might need help someday. I used to nod when he said things like that because contradiction felt pointless. But when he laughed that morning, I realized how much space I'd surrendered by staying agreeable. I remember going out for a walk after the call, even though the weather was cold and gray. The bakery owner, a young woman named Emilia, was sweeping the sidewalk, and she waved to me through the steam that escaped from the doorway. I waved back and kept walking down the street lined with small shops that smelled of oil and morning bread. The world looked the same as it always did, ordinary, indifferent. But I felt different inside it, heavier and clearer at once. Every window reflected a woman I barely recognized. A face with lines deep as the life that made them, hair pulled into a neat knot, posture careful, almost apologetic. That was the woman my son saw, the one he'd already placed in the category of dependent. He couldn't imagine that behind that face lived someone who'd managed more budgets, more crises, more nights of quiet arithmetic than he ever would. When I came back home, I opened the small safe under my bed. Inside were the papers I never talked about. The savings account my husband and I had opened 40 years ago. The modest mutual funds I'd kept feeding even after his death. The property deed for the apartment I bought outright 15 years earlier. I'd never told Greg because he'd never asked, and because money had always made him restless. He liked to be the one who offered, not the one who received. And maybe I'd wanted to protect him from the truth, that his mother didn't need rescuing, that she was, in her own quiet way, free. Freedom, I've learned, is something people either admire or resent. It depends on how much they crave it themselves. That afternoon, I wrote a note on the back of an old grocery list. I am not broke. I am simply done being borrowed. I didn't show it to anyone. I folded it and slipped it into the drawer with my bank cards, like a small promise to myself. Then I made tea and sat by the window watching the rain thread down the glass. Across the street, two boys were arguing over a soccer ball, their laughter cutting through the drizzle. It reminded me of Greg when he was little, stubborn, quick to smile, quick to forget. I used to think that kind of confidence was a blessing. Now I saw it for what it was: protection built on the assumption that someone else will clean up the consequences. I had been that someone all his life. The next day, he called again, lighter this time, as if nothing had happened. "Mom, don't be mad," he said. "I was just kidding yesterday." I told him I wasn't mad, and I wasn't lying. What I felt was older than anger, calmer. It was understanding. When you reach my age, you stop waiting for apologies that require too much imagination from the giver. You learn to translate laughter into confession. His had told me everything I needed to know. That evening, I opened my old ledger, the one with the faded blue cover I'd used when I managed the household finances decades ago. I ran my fingers over the columns of numbers, the neat handwriting of a woman who believed in order. Every figure on those pages was a fragment of survival. Groceries balanced against overtime pay, medical bills spaced between birthdays. A secret rhythm of scarcity turned into stability. I realized I wasn't ashamed of it anymore. I was proud. That laugh had tried to erase a lifetime of quiet competence, and it failed. I slept lightly that night, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of the pipes. Around midnight, I got up, pulled on my robe, and went to the window. The street was empty except for the bakery truck delivering flour sacks. The driver carried them on his shoulder, steady and unhurried. I thought of how many years I'd done the same, carried the weight of others as if it were duty, not choice. Maybe that's what broke me. Not poverty, but the constant bending to prove I wasn't a burden. I whispered into the dark, almost amused. "You're broke, anyway." The words sounded different in my mouth. Lighter, ironic, reclaimed. By morning, I had decided that no one would ever again define my worth by what I gave away. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, strong and bitter the way I like it, and sat down to plan my week. I wasn't plotting revenge or confrontation, just clarity. It was the first time in years I'd thought of my life as something still unfolding, not already archived. Outside, the city stirred awake, unaware that a small revolution had begun in a room above a bakery, led by a woman her own son believed had nothing left. I smiled into my cup. Broke, perhaps, but only of illusions. It was 2 weeks after that phone call when the real betrayal took shape, quiet at first, like a bruise beneath the skin that hasn't yet turned purple. Greg arrived one afternoon without calling ahead, something he rarely did. He stood in the doorway with that impatient brightness of a man who thinks he's bringing opportunity to someone too slow to grasp it. I was folding laundry in the living room, the small, rhythmic comfort of cotton and order, when his shadow darkened the doorway. "You're not dressed," he said, scanning me as if I'd forgotten a meeting. I told him I didn't know I was supposed to be. He laughed that same dismissive laugh again, softer this time, more like the purr of entitlement than cruelty. "You'll want to change," he said. "I'm taking you to meet someone. He's with the bank." At first I thought he wanted to talk about his loan again, maybe ask for advice, maybe even an apology wrapped in practical language. But when we got to the cafe, one of those sterile, echoing places where everyone pretends to work on laptops, he introduced me not as his mother, but as a silent partner. The man across the table was from the bank indeed, middle-aged, slick in the way people become when they live on commission. He shook my hand too quickly and began speaking in numbers that were supposed to sound impressive. Greg leaned back in his chair, proud, explaining that with our combined collateral, the expansion was practically guaranteed. I didn't understand right away what he meant by combined. My tea arrived lukewarm, and while I stirred in the sugar, I watched the banker slide a folder across the table with a pen clipped neatly inside. Greg said my name like a formality. "Mom, this is just paperwork. Standard cosigner documentation. We'll both be on it, but it's really just a formality. You know how it works?" The folder lay open between us, and there it was. My name printed beneath his, the numbers larger than anything I'd ever seen attached to me. It wasn't a small business loan. It was a property development investment, high risk, the kind that eats people alive when the market sneezes. I stared at the papers, the precise lines of text, the waiting space for my signature, and then I looked at my son. His face was animated, boyish even, like when he used to show me his school projects. He had that same look of untested confidence, only now it was draped in adulthood and arrogance. I didn't say anything right away. The banker filled the silence with more jargon about short-term returns and leverage. Greg interrupted, impatient. "She gets it. She's always been good with money." That last sentence, meant as flattery, landed like a threat. I asked him to give me a day to think, to review the documents. He frowned, the charm faltering for a fraction of a second. "Mom, it's time-sensitive," he said. "The offer expires tomorrow. Don't overthink it." The banker smiled thinly, pretending not to notice the edge in his voice. I told Greg again, calmly, that I would look it over that evening. He sighed and leaned back, shaking his head as if I were a child refusing medicine. "You don't trust me," he said. I didn't answer. He filled the silence again, this time with that familiar condescension. "I mean, you're not exactly in a position to take big risks. This is how families build something lasting." Families. The word sounded foreign. I'd spent a lifetime building things that lasted: homes, meals, stability, habits of care, and now, apparently, it all counted for nothing because I hadn't leveraged it into profit. I pushed the folder back toward him and said, "Then you'll build it, Greg. You don't need me." He looked at me as though I had insulted him in public. His jaw tightened, his voice lowering just enough to sound dangerous. "You can't be serious," he said. "Do you have any idea what this could mean for us?" "For us," he said, though he never once explained what I would gain. I folded my hands around the warm mug of tea and said softly, "I do know what it could mean. For me, debt. And that's not a souvenir I need. He laughed, but there was no humor this time, only frustration sharpened into mockery. "You've been living so small for so long you can't even see an opportunity when it's right in front of you," he said. "Do you think your pension will carry you forever? Come on, Mom. You're not getting any younger." It wasn't just the words. It was the way he said Mom, clipped, managerial, as though he were delivering a performance review. I felt the heat rise behind my eyes, not from sadness, but from clarity. This was not a misunderstanding. This was how he saw me now. A liability to be managed, a resource to be tapped. I finished my tea, set the cup down gently, and told him we were done for the day. He muttered something about stubbornness running in the family as he gathered his papers. That evening, he called twice. I didn't answer. On the third call, I picked up. He didn't apologize. He tried persuasion instead, that subtle tone of guilt wrapped in reason. "Mom, you always said we should help each other," he reminded me. "I helped you with your new phone last year, remember?" I almost laughed at the absurdity, the arithmetic of his affection. I told him he was right about one thing. I wasn't getting any younger, which meant I had no time left for bad deals, not financial ones, not emotional ones. He hung up without saying goodbye. The next morning, I went to my bank. The teller was a young woman with pink nails and a polite, professional smile. I asked to check on all my accounts, to verify the balances, to update security settings. She typed briskly, then asked if I wanted to add an authorized user. My son's name, perhaps. "No," I said. "Remove any previous links, if you find them." She blinked, a little confused, and then nodded. While she worked, I looked around the bank. The posters on the wall about family planning and legacy management. Every image was the same. Smiling young couples, an elderly parent in soft focus behind them, faded at the edges. I realized that's how the world had started to see women like me. Not as individuals, but as supporting cast in someone else's financial story. When I left the bank, the air outside felt different. Colder. Cleaner. I bought myself a newspaper and a pastry from the bakery downstairs, then sat by the window in my apartment to read. There was an article about the rising cost of living, about older adults being financially vulnerable. The phrase made me smile. Vulnerable is what people call you when they want permission to control you. I folded the paper neatly and took out my notebook. I wrote at the top of the page, "I will not be someone's collateral." 2 days later, a letter arrived in my mailbox, a courier envelope with Greg's handwriting. Inside was another set of documents, this time labeled Simplified Cosign Agreement. He had mailed it directly, bypassing conversation. There was a note. "Just sign where highlighted, Mom. It's less complicated now. I've already taken care of the rest." The arrogance of it made me dizzy. He wasn't asking anymore. He was assuming compliance. I took the papers out to the kitchen, laid them flat on the counter, and made myself a cup of tea. I didn't tear them up. I didn't throw them away. I placed them in the small drawer beside the stove where I keep spare receipts. Sometimes the best answer isn't no. It's silence that stretches long enough to make the other person hear themselves. That night, I dreamed of my husband, Tom, standing in the old kitchen of our first house, his hands dusty from the workshop. He used to say, "Never sign something you didn't read twice and live through once." I woke before dawn, the words still in my head. The envelope was still on the counter, heavy with unspoken things. I made coffee, sat down, and wrote Greg a short letter in return. "I love you," I wrote, "but I will not gamble with my peace to buy your pride. Please don't ask again." I sealed it, mailed it, and for the first time in years, felt the quiet weight of authority in my hands, the kind that doesn't need witnesses. He didn't reply right away, but I could sense the distance forming, the subtle punishment of silence that follows when love collides with disappointment. The calls became shorter, the tone cooler. When he did speak, it was all logistics, weather, errands, his children's schedules. He never mentioned the loan again. But something else had broken loose in me. I began to see every polite conversation we'd had over the years differently. How many of them had been transactions disguised as affection. I realized that the betrayal hadn't started with the folder on the cafe table. It had been building quietly for years in every assumption, every sentence that began with, "You don't mind, do you?" And yet, sitting there in that apartment above the smell of fresh bread, I didn't feel destroyed. I felt awake. His laughter had been the spark, but this, the attempt to sign my name into his debt, was the fire. Betrayal, I've learned, doesn't always scream. Sometimes it wears your child's smile and speaks in the language of family. But once you hear the undertone, you can't unhear it. I poured another cup of coffee, folded my hands around the warmth, and whispered to the empty room, not bitterly, but with finality. "You were wrong, Greg. I'm not broke. I'm just done being bought." After the envelope and the silence that followed, things didn't fall apart dramatically. They frayed slowly, thread by thread, the way fabric does when it's been rubbed too many times in the same place. Greg stopped calling every week, then every other week. By spring, the contact had dwindled to brief texts, polite but hollow. "How are you feeling?" Or, "Kids say hi." I always answered with the same restraint, a few sentences of reassurance, nothing too personal. I wasn't angry anymore, at least not in the way anger announces itself. What I felt was something quieter and far more permanent, a kind of cooling that happens after the last coal has burned out and the ashes settle into their final shape. The rhythm of our relationship had shifted. He didn't know it yet, but I did. I could feel the balance of power returning to me, not as triumph, but as gravity, steady and inevitable. It was around that time that I started noticing small things. The way people at the pharmacy offered me cheaper generics assuming I couldn't afford better, or how the bank teller, a new one this time, spoke to me in a tone that sounded like, translation, each word delivered slowly as though money were a foreign language to me. I didn't correct them. Let them underestimate. It was easier to move unnoticed that way. I began to understand that invisibility, when chosen, could be a kind of armor. For most of my life, I'd been visible only when someone needed something: emotional labor, childcare, the convenient willingness of a mother who could always be counted on. Now, finally, no one was asking. The silence was unnerving at first, but then it became something close to peace. One evening, I found myself reorganizing the old files in the cabinet. Insurance papers, tax returns, hospital letters from when Tom was still alive. Among them was a yellowed envelope with my handwriting on it. Mortgage paid in full, 2009. I'd forgotten how proud we were that day, how we'd gone out for Chinese food and toasted with cheap champagne, laughing like conspirators who'd outwitted the system. Tom had always said the key to freedom was modest ownership, no debt, no begging, no owing. At the time, it sounded like a small dream. Now I realized it was a shield. When I touched that piece of paper, something inside me straightened. I understood that I had spent decades quietly building fortresses in plain sight, and everyone, including my son, had mistaken them for ruins. Around that same time, Greg's wife, Allison, began calling me. At first, she was all sweetness, as if nothing had happened. She wanted to know if I could come for Sunday lunch, maybe see the kids. No big discussions. I went once, out of habit more than hope. Their house looked larger than before, or maybe emptier. There were expensive throw pillows on every couch, fresh orchids in vases, everything curated to project stability. But under that perfection, the air was strained. Greg avoided my eyes. The children were polite but distracted, absorbed by their glowing screens. When we finally sat to eat, the conversation was brittle and shallow. Allison mentioned that the business was still pending, and that Greg was under pressure. I nodded politely, and that small act of restraint seemed to irritate her. "He's just trying to build something for the family," she said. "Sometimes men need a bit of faith." I smiled, a slow and steady smile. "Faith is one thing," I said quietly. "Signatures are another." That silenced the table for a moment. The youngest child asked if anyone wanted dessert, trying to cut through the tension. I praised the pie, thanked Allison, and excused myself early, blaming a headache. On my way out, I saw Greg standing by the front door, phone in hand, half turned away. He said without looking up, "I guess we won't be seeing you much then." It wasn't a question. I answered, "Only if you call," and he didn't. After that, I stopped waiting for family gatherings. The invitations grew infrequent and perfunctory. I could feel myself being edited out of their story, replaced by polite updates and Christmas cards that never arrived on time. It hurt. Of course it did. But it also clarified something. Families are not ruined by single acts of cruelty. They die from consistent erasures, the slow rewriting of loyalty into obligation, affection into formality. What remained between us was the shape of something that had once been love. I poured my energy into small, deliberate routines. Each morning, I walked to the park with a notebook and wrote lists, things to repair, things to let go, things I had been afraid to admit I wanted. I realized that in all my years of caring for others, I'd forgotten what I enjoyed. So I started finding out. I joined a local reading group at the library, mostly women my age, all with the same look of gentle defiance in their eyes. We read novels about people younger than us and laughed at how little the characters knew about endurance. I began volunteering once a week at a hospice, doing paperwork and occasionally sitting with patients who didn't have visitors. There was something humbling and freeing about being useful without being needed. No one there asked me for money, for advice, or for forgiveness. They just asked if I could stay a little longer while the morphine settled in. I did. Yet, even as I built this quieter life, traces of the old one found their way back to me. Once, when I went to withdraw some cash, I overheard two young bank clerks whispering as I left the counter. One said, "It's so sad when they have to count every penny." And the other replied, "Yeah, she looks like she's on her last few dollars." I almost turned around to correct them, to tell them that I had more than enough, that my account held more than their annual salaries combined. But then I realized how satisfying it was to let them be wrong. There is power in the knowledge others deny you. I walked out smiling, folded the bills into my wallet, and treated myself to lunch at the small Italian cafe near the park. Around that same week, Greg sent me a text. "Can you talk? Need some advice about refinancing?" The irony almost made me laugh. I didn't reply right away. I took my time, finished my meal, watched the sunlight tilt across the tables, and only then wrote back. "You should speak to a professional, dear. I've retired from giving advice." He didn't respond, but I knew he'd read it. There was satisfaction in that too, the subtle reversal of dependency. At night, I started keeping my phone off. The peace that came with that silence was something I hadn't known I was missing. Without the constant ping of messages or the pressure of being reachable, I began to hear other things. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, the small sounds of a life that had always been there but never fully noticed. It felt like listening to myself breathe again after years of holding it in. Then one afternoon I saw Greg by chance at the grocery store. He was standing by the produce section, looking older, heavier around the shoulders, his phone pressed to his ear. He didn't see me at first. I watched him for a moment. The gestures, the sighs, the performance of authority. When he finally turned and our eyes met, there was a flicker of something like embarrassment. "Mom," he said, forcing a smile, "you look good." I thanked him and asked how he was. He gave a vague answer about projects, then hesitated. "You know, we should sit down soon, clear the air," he added, his tone rehearsed. "Things got weird." I nodded. "They got honest," I said. He blinked, unsure how to respond. I reached for a bag of apples and told him to take care of himself. When I walked away, I could feel his stare on my back, a mixture of resentment and confusion. It was the first time I'd left a conversation with him feeling taller. That night, I took out the old ledger again. I looked at the columns of my past life, the small balances, the notes about groceries, bills, medical expenses, and realized that every line was a testament to endurance, a map of choices that no one had ever celebrated because they weren't grand. Just steady. I decided to start a new column in that same ledger, not for numbers this time, but for boundaries. Every time I said no, every time I chose myself over guilt, I wrote it down. It was a way of tracking progress that no bank could measure. In the months that followed, Greg's voice became an occasional echo, mostly through Allison's careful texts. I think she pitied me, though she would never admit it. Once she wrote, "He's stressed, you know. He feels like you don't believe in him." I typed and deleted many responses before finally writing, "Belief is earned, not demanded." After that, she stopped messaging. The distance, once painful, began to feel protective, almost sacred. The air in my apartment grew lighter, as if the walls themselves had exhaled after years of absorbing tension. And yet, even in my quiet, I could feel the tremors of what was still to come. I knew Greg wouldn't let it rest. Pride doesn't dissolve, it ferments. I sensed he was struggling, that the business he'd bet everything on was not the success he'd imagined. Rumors trickled through mutual acquaintances, small comments like, "Greg's been under a lot of pressure lately," or, "He's talking about restructuring." I said nothing, offered no advice, no help. I had already played that role to exhaustion. I simply waited, not for his downfall, but for his realization that the woman he dismissed as broke was the only one who had ever truly understood value. The escalation wasn't loud, but it was real. It was the slow erosion of his illusion and the solidification of my independence. Every day that passed without me bending was a kind of quiet rebellion. I had thought that freedom would feel like flight, but it felt more like gravity. Firm, inevitable, mine. And while Greg struggled to balance what he owed and what he wanted, I had already balanced my books long ago, not in dollars, but in peace. The shift did not arrive as an announcement or a burst of courage. It came quietly one morning, when I was sitting by the window with my coffee going cold and a dull ache in my knees reminding me that time had moved on, without permission. I remember staring at the same view I saw every day, the bakery truck idling at the curb, the school children crossing the street, the neighbor's cat prowling along the fence, and feeling an odd stillness, as though the world had briefly paused to see what I would do next. I realized that for months I had been living defensively, managing the aftermath of Greg's disappointment as if it were a chronic condition. Every thought revolved around his silence, his absence, his possible next move. Even my independence had been defined by him, in opposition to him, and that realization made me feel suddenly absurd, like a puppet who thought she had cut her strings only to find them knotted into new shapes. I set the coffee down, walked to the mirror, and looked at the woman standing there. Gray hair coiled neatly, face lined not from age but from effort. I asked her out loud, "What now?" She didn't answer, but her eyes held mine long enough that I began to see a faint outline of an answer forming somewhere behind them. That afternoon I took the bus into town, something I hadn't done in years. It felt strange at first, sitting among people whose lives were in motion. Young mothers with strollers, office workers scrolling through phones, an old man humming softly to himself. But by the time we crossed the bridge, I felt a peculiar sense of belonging. I had always driven everywhere when Tom was alive, as though public transportation were a concession to defeat. But now it felt liberating. I could observe without being observed. The city looked different from the bus window. Not grand, not cruel, just human. When I reached the center, I stepped off near the park and walked without destination until I found myself in front of a small, old-fashioned bank that looked almost out of place among the glass storefronts. Something made me go in. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps instinct. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of polish and paper. The clerk, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a patient posture, greeted me. I told him I wanted to speak to someone about setting up a trust. He raised his brows slightly but didn't question it. Within a few minutes, I was sitting in a small office with a financial advisor who looked younger than Greg. She listened carefully as I explained what I wanted: to consolidate my savings, pension, and investments into a secure account in my name only, with clear instructions for its future use. "Do you have beneficiaries in mind?" she asked gently. "Eventually," I said, "but not yet. For now, I'd like to make sure the money serves me while I'm alive." There was something thrilling about saying that, almost scandalous. I had spent so long thinking of money only as something to be distributed, to be given, to be translated into someone else's comfort. To imagine it serving me was to break a silent rule I hadn't even known I'd obeyed. The process took nearly 2 hours. By the end of it, I had new accounts, new passwords, new documentation, and a new feeling of steadiness. When I stepped outside, the light seemed sharper, the air thinner, as if the city itself had been scrubbed clean. I walked to a nearby cafe and ordered a slice of cake I didn't need. I ate it slowly, tasting not just sugar, but freedom, the sweet sting of self-authorization. It wasn't rebellion exactly. It was restoration. Over the next few weeks, I continued making small, deliberate choices. I canceled the automatic transfers that had been set up years ago for Greg's children's extracurriculars, piano lessons, sports fees, all those little expenses that had somehow become permanent fixtures in my budget. I wrote polite notes explaining that Grandma was simplifying her finances. I expected backlash, but none came. Perhaps they hadn't even noticed yet. Perhaps the absence of my contribution would register only when the next invoice arrived. Either way, it was no longer my problem. With each cancellation, each quiet act of severance, I felt lighter, as if I were slowly unpacking a suitcase I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for decades. Around that time, Amelia from the bakery downstairs asked if I could help with bookkeeping. Her accountant had left suddenly, and she was drowning in receipts. I hesitated at first. It had been years since I'd done any formal work, and part of me feared that I was too old, too slow, too out of step. But she insisted, saying, "You have that calm look of someone who can sort chaos." So I agreed. Every afternoon, I would sit at the small table in the corner of the bakery with a cup of coffee and the smell of dough rising around me, sorting through papers, reconciling numbers, organizing what others had neglected. It was ordinary work, simple and precise, but it filled me with a satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. I began to understand that dignity was not in titles or salaries. It was in purpose freely chosen. People started recognizing me. Regular customers who nodded, children who waved. I wasn't invisible anymore. Not because someone needed me, but because I was present. One evening, as I was closing the ledger, Amelia handed me an envelope with a small payment inside. "For your help," she said. I tried to refuse, but she shook her head. "You've earned it." The phrase startled me more than the money. It had been a long time since anyone had said that to me. I walked home that evening with the envelope tucked into my pocket like a secret. And when I opened it later, I didn't spend the money. I kept it in a small jar on the shelf labeled "My Own." As the weeks turned into months, my routine became a rhythm that felt like life rather than survival. I woke early, worked at the bakery, read in the park, cooked meals for myself that tasted of care rather than convenience. Sometimes I thought of Greg, wondered what he was doing, if he was struggling or thriving. But I didn't call. Not out of spite, but because I had nothing left to prove. He would either learn the value of humility or he wouldn't. That was no longer my responsibility. One Saturday, I received a letter from an old friend, a retired nurse who had moved to the coast years ago. She wrote about her volunteer work at a community clinic, about the joy of teaching young trainees, about finding meaning again after retirement. Her words stirred something in me. I realized that my life wasn't over. It had simply changed tempo. The thought both frightened and exhilarated me. I had spent so many years associating aging with contraction, as if life were a series of rooms we kept moving out of until all that was left was one small corner of memory. But now, in my quiet routines and unexpected usefulness, I saw the opposite happening. My world was widening, not narrowing. It was also around that time that I bought a new coat. It wasn't extravagant, just a navy wool coat with deep pockets and a fitted waist. But when I put it on, I felt different. Taller, surer, visible to myself again. I remember looking in the mirror and thinking how strange it was that something as simple as fabric could make a person remember who she was. I wore it the next morning to the bakery, and Amelia smiled when she saw me. "You look like someone important," she said. I told her I was, and we both laughed, though I wasn't joking. One evening, after closing up the bakery, I sat with Amelia on the back steps drinking tea. She asked if I had family nearby. I told her I had a son in another part of the city, but that we weren't close. She nodded slowly, her expression neither pitying nor curious, just understanding. "Sometimes," she said, "family is what you build after you stop apologizing for being yourself." I thought about that long after she went inside. It sounded almost too simple. But maybe truth always does when you're finally ready to hear it. That night, as I sat by the window in my navy coat draped over the chair, I felt something I hadn't in years. Peace without guilt. The kind that doesn't ask for permission or explanation. I realized the shift had already happened. I hadn't planned it, hadn't forced it. It had unfolded the moment I stopped measuring my worth by someone else's validation. Greg's laughter, his dismissiveness, even his betrayal. They were not the endings I'd once feared, but the openings I hadn't expected. The midpoint, I suppose, though I didn't know it then, of a story still unfolding. When I went to bed, I left the curtains open. The streetlight spilled across the floor in soft gold lines, and I thought of Tom again, of the way he used to say, "Don't let anyone make you small, Mary. The world will try, but you've got to stay the size of your own truth." For the first time, I believed I finally understood him. It started with the letter, of course. They always do. Paper has a way of arriving when people don't have the courage to speak. It was a thick white envelope with my name written in Greg's careful, deliberate handwriting, the kind he used when he wanted to appear calm. I found it wedged in my mailbox one Tuesday morning, the same day Amelia was baking a new batch of croissants, the smell of butter filling the stairwell. For a moment, I considered leaving it there, pretending it had never arrived. But curiosity is a stubborn muscle. It twitches even when you've trained yourself not to care. I carried it upstairs, laid it on the kitchen table beside my coffee cup, and stared at it for a long while before opening it. Inside were 6 pages written in blue ink, every line pressed too hard into the paper as though anger could etch permanence. He began without greeting, no "Mom," no softness, just, "I can't believe you're doing this." The letter read like an indictment, not a conversation. He accused me of withholding love, of acting out of pride, of making things harder for the family when they needed me most. "You've always said family comes first," he wrote. "But lately it feels like you only care about yourself." He mentioned Allison's stress, the children's confusion, his sleepless nights. Each paragraph was a manipulation dressed as confession. What he didn't mention, what pulsed beneath every word, was money, the failed business, the debts, the quiet panic of a man who had overreached. He wrote that he couldn't understand how I could turn away from him now, after all the sacrifices he had made for me. I laughed out loud at that line, the sound startling in my small kitchen. Sacrifices. The word felt foreign in his mouth. I read the letter twice, then folded it neatly, placed it back in the envelope, and slid it into the drawer with my grocery coupons. I wasn't angry. I'd already done anger. What I felt was something sharper, almost clean, a clarity that comes when you see a pattern for what it truly is. That evening, as I was closing up the bakery's accounts, Amelia noticed my silence. She asked if everything was all right. I told her about the letter, or at least the shape of it, not the details. She nodded slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. "Sometimes they write when they realize they can't talk their way back in," she said. "It's not about the words, it's about control." I knew she was right. I could feel it in the careful phrasing of Greg's sentences, the way guilt had been stretched to sound like love. I went home that night and didn't sleep. Instead, I made tea and sat by the window, the steam fogging the glass as rain tapped against it. I thought about how the people who hurt you most are often the ones who insist it's your misunderstanding. Somewhere in that thought, I decided that if he wanted to play at appearances, I would let him, but on my terms. A few days later, the performance began. A neighbor I barely knew stopped me outside the bakery and said she'd seen something on the local news website. A community notice about a missing elderly woman. My name. My face. An old photo of me from Greg's wedding, smiling, holding a bouquet I hadn't chosen. The article quoted him. "We're deeply concerned for her safety. She's been out of contact and may be disoriented." I stood there, frozen, as the words sank in. Disoriented, vulnerable, missing. It was grotesque theater disguised as concern. He'd turned my silence into pathology. When I got home, I found another letter waiting, this time not from Greg, but from a lawyer. A Mr. Sorensen. The tone was polished, rehearsed, legal in its empathy. "Your family is requesting verification of your well-being," it said, "and exploring options to ensure your financial security." I could practically hear the subtext screaming, guardianship, control, access. My hands shook, not from fear, but from disbelief that my own son would twist worry into ownership. I sat down, poured myself a small glass of wine, and let the absurdity wash over me. Then I did what I've always done when someone tries to take something from me. I started writing. The next morning I mailed 2 letters, one to the lawyer. Concise, unemotional, final. I stated that I was of sound mind, in full possession of my faculties, and under no duress. I added that any further contact made under the pretense of concern would be considered harassment. I signed it neatly and mailed it certified. The second letter was to Greg. Only 3 lines. "I know what you're doing. I'm not angry. I'm not coming back. Take care of your life now. I finally started mine." It wasn't revenge. It was punctuation. For a week, there was silence again, the heavy kind that hums just under the noise of daily life. I went to work, counted receipts, laughed with Amelia about customers who didn't know the difference between macaroons and macarons. But beneath that normalcy, I could feel the tremor of something coming. When people like Greg lose control, they don't surrender. They regroup. One morning, as I was wiping down the counter, the bell over the bakery door jingled. I looked up, and there she was, Allison. Perfectly dressed as always, every hair in place, her perfume expensive and faintly aggressive. She smiled, but her eyes were calculating. "Martha," she said softly, "you look well." It was the voice of someone rehearsing diplomacy. I told her I was fine, that she should try the new almond croissant. She ignored the suggestion. "Greg didn't know I was coming," she said, as if that were a confession. "He's been under a lot of pressure." I said I was sure he had. She glanced around the bakery, her gaze lingering on the shelves, the worn floor, the soft light from the window. "I can see why you like it here," she said, though her tone suggested she couldn't see it at all. She asked if we could sit somewhere private. I agreed, mostly because I wanted to see how far the script would go. We found a small table in the corner. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "He's worried, you know, about you, about how things have turned out." I smiled. "He seems to worry most when things don't go his way." She flinched at that, a small twitch near her mouth. "He's not a bad person," she said quickly. "He's just proud." I almost laughed. "I know," I said. "He learned it from me." She reached into her purse and pulled out another envelope. "He doesn't know I'm giving you this," she said. Inside was a check, a large one. "He wanted you to have something," she added. I stared at the paper for a long moment, then slid it back across the table. "No," I said. "I have enough." Her eyes flashed, a mix of pity and irritation. "This isn't about money," she insisted. "It's about peace." I folded my hands and said, "Peace doesn't come with a signature line." For a moment I thought she might cry, but instead she straightened, composure restored. "You've always been so dramatic," she said. "It's exhausting." I smiled again, not unkindly. "Then maybe you should rest." She stood up abruptly, muttered a polite goodbye, and left, leaving the scent of her perfume and the check between us. I folded it in half, tore it twice, and dropped it in the trash. Later that afternoon, Emilia asked what had happened. I told her only that someone had tried to buy me back. She nodded as if she'd expected that. "They never know what to do with women who can't be bought," she said. "It confuses them." That night, I wrote another letter, this time to Kieran, my eldest grandchild, the only one who had ever really seen me. I told him I was fine, that I was proud of him, that I hoped he would never confuse love with debt. I didn't mention his parents. A week passed before the next escalation. This time it came not through paper, but flesh. Greg himself. He showed up at the bakery just before closing, his coat damp from rain, his face drawn. I could tell he hadn't been sleeping. He hovered by the door before approaching, like a man uncertain whether he was welcome. Emilia looked at me, silently asking if I wanted her to intervene. I shook my head. He walked over slowly and said, "Can we talk?" I told him we could, but only if he bought something first. He blinked, unsure if I was joking. He bought a coffee and sat across from me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "You've made this very hard." I stirred my tea, said nothing. "Do you have any idea what people are saying?" he continued. "They think I've lost control of my own mother." I looked at him and said, "That's because you tried to make me your property." His face twisted with disbelief. "That's not what this is," he said. "I was just trying to make sure you were safe." I smiled. "You mean supervised?" He shook his head, rubbing his temples. "You're impossible." "No," I said quietly. "I'm independent. There's a difference." He leaned forward then, his tone softening. "Mom, I didn't mean to hurt you. Everything's falling apart. The business, the loans. It's not what I planned. I thought maybe we could—" He stopped, as if the word "we" had lost its meaning. I waited. When he didn't finish, I said, "You thought maybe I could fix it, like always." He looked away, shame flickering across his face. "You don't understand how hard it's been," he said. I set down my cup. "Greg," I said evenly, "I understand perfectly. I just don't confuse hardship with entitlement anymore." He exhaled, defeated, and for the first time in years, he looked young again, lost. "So that's it?" he asked. "You're just done?" I nodded. "With the guilt, yes. With you, no. You're my son. But love doesn't mean obedience." He didn't know what to do with that. He sat there for a moment, hands trembling slightly, then stood up. "You'll regret this," he said quietly, almost to himself. I replied, "Maybe. But at least the regret will be mine." When he left, I expected to feel hollow, but instead, I felt something closer to relief, like air rushing into a room long sealed. I walked home in the rain, my coat heavy, but my steps light. The city glistened, indifferent, alive. I realized that the storm I had feared had already passed. What remained was aftermath, a landscape stripped clean, raw, honest. That night, as I undressed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. There was no triumph there, no bitterness, just a calm recognition. The woman staring back at me was no longer the mother waiting for permission to exist. She was her own witness now, her own protector. I brushed my hair, turned off the light, and whispered into the dark, "You were wrong, Greg. I wasn't lost. I was finding the way out." In the days that followed, I expected more letters, more drama, but none came. Perhaps he had finally understood, or perhaps he was regrouping once more. It didn't matter. I had fortified my life quietly. New bank arrangements, legal documents in place, my chosen confidants informed. There would be no next time. The escalation had reached its peak and collapsed under its own weight, leaving behind not chaos, but clarity. I still went to work each morning, still brewed my coffee, still greeted the same people on the street. But everything felt different. The world hadn't changed. I had. And in that transformation, I found something I hadn't felt in years. Peace that no one could sign away. It was late October when the decision finally took shape. Not as a thought, but as a physical certainty. Like a weight in my chest that had been shifting for months, trying to find its balance. The air had turned crisp. The bakery downstairs began filling the mornings with the smell of roasted chestnuts and cinnamon, and the light through my window grew thinner, gentler, as though even the sun had started to move more carefully through the day. I had been living in a kind of stillness since that last conversation with Greg. Peaceful, yes, but also incomplete, as though something remained unfinished, unsaid, unresolved. I knew it wasn't enough to defend my independence quietly. I needed to mark it, to draw a line visible not just to him, but to myself. There's a moment in every long struggle where silence stops being self-preservation and becomes complicity, and I had reached it. The first spark came from an unexpected place. An article in the local paper about a scholarship program for nursing students. It mentioned the shortage of nurses in small rural hospitals and the difficulty many young women faced balancing study with care responsibilities. The story hit me like a pulse. I had been that woman once, years ago, walking home from late shifts, calculating groceries and tuition in the same breath, believing that if I just worked hard enough, the world would eventually become fair. Reading those words, I felt something stir. The old discipline, the quiet fierceness that had carried me through every night shift and emergency. I realized that if my life had taught me anything, it was that survival without generosity turns into isolation, and generosity without boundaries turns into servitude. What I wanted now was neither. What I wanted was legacy, a gesture that would outlive both my bitterness and his arrogance. So I began the preparations in secret. I contacted the same advisor who had helped me set up the trust months earlier, a patient woman named Clara who spoke with a kind of precision that made you feel both safe and seen. I told her I wanted to establish a small foundation in my husband's name, a scholarship for nursing students from low-income families, funded through my savings and investments. She asked if I wanted to include family members as co-signers or beneficiaries. I said no. She hesitated only for a second, then nodded. "You're certain?" she asked. "Completely," I said. The word came out steady and full, as though I had been rehearsing it all my life. Over the next few weeks, we met several times, signing documents, transferring funds, setting up the structure that would protect the scholarship from interference. Each signature I wrote felt like a strike of clarity, a correction in a long, messy history. Clara handled everything with professionalism, but there was one moment when she looked up from the paperwork and said quietly, "You know, this is a remarkable thing you're doing." I smiled and answered, "It's not remarkable. It's overdue." When all was done, she handed me a folder embossed with my husband's name. The Thomas Green Nursing Scholarship Fund. I ran my fingers over the raised letters and felt an unexpected wave of tenderness. For the first time in years, I felt connected not to loss, but to continuation. I decided to tell Greg in person, not out of obligation, but because some endings require witnesses. I called him and asked if he could come by the bakery one afternoon. His voice on the phone was cautious, almost subdued. "What is this about?" he asked. "Closure," I said simply. When he arrived, he looked older than I remembered, his hair thinner, the confidence in his movements tempered by weariness. There was a time when that would have softened me, but not now. We sat at the same corner table where we'd spoken months earlier. I poured tea for both of us and slid the folder across the table. "What's this?" he asked, his voice guarded. "It's my final act as your mother in the financial sense," I said. "Everything I've saved, everything I've worked for, it's been moved. Half has gone into a foundation in your father's name. The rest is secured for my care and for donations to the hospice I volunteer with." He stared at the folder, then at me, disbelief flickering across his face. "You gave it away?" he said slowly. "You gave my inheritance to strangers?" "Not strangers," I corrected. "Students. The kind of people who remind me who I used to be before my generosity became invisible." He opened the folder, scanning the documents, his expression tightening. "You could have talked to me first," he said, his voice rising. "We could have made this decision together." I held his gaze. "We stopped making decisions together when you stopped seeing me as someone capable of making them." His mouth opened, closed, opened again, but no words came. He stood abruptly, pacing beside the table. "Do you have any idea how this looks? How this makes me look? People will think I couldn't even take care of my own mother." I sipped my tea, letting his words hang in the air. "Perhaps," I said, "or they'll think your mother finally learned to take care of herself." He stared at me, his face flushing. "You've lost it," he said quietly, almost pityingly. "You're throwing away your life's work for pride." I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice. "No, Greg. I'm reclaiming it for peace. Pride is what kept you from asking for help before it was too late. Peace is what keeps me from fixing what you broke." For a long moment, there was only the sound of the clock on the wall and the faint hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. Then he said, almost in a whisper, "So that's it? You're cutting me out completely?" I looked at him carefully, searching for the boy he once was, the one who used to bring me dandelions from the yard, believing they were as precious as roses. "I'm not cutting you out," I said softly. "I'm setting you free. You don't owe me gratitude, and I don't owe you guilt." He swallowed hard, eyes darting away, and for the first time, I saw not anger, but something like fear. The realization that his control had slipped beyond recovery. He left without saying goodbye. I watched him walk away through the bakery window, his shoulders hunched, his steps uneven. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt emptied, cleansed, as though something long decayed had finally been lifted out of me. Later that evening, Emilia found me still sitting there, staring at the folder. "Was it hard?" she asked. I nodded. "It was necessary," I said. She placed a warm loaf of bread in front of me and said, "Then eat. The world doesn't end on a decision. It begins there." That night, I took the folder home, placed it in the safe under my bed, and sat in the dark for a long time. I thought about Tom again, about how he used to tell me that every person gets 2 deaths, the first when the body fails, and the second when the world forgets your name. I smiled, realizing that through this foundation, through every nurse who would carry his name forward, I had postponed that second death indefinitely, and maybe, in doing so, I had saved myself from it too. A week later, Clara sent me a photo by email. It showed the first 3 scholarship recipients, young women in scrubs standing in front of the hospital where I had once worked, holding certificates and smiling shyly. I printed the photo and pinned it to my kitchen wall. Every morning after that, I looked at their faces while I drank my coffee, and each time, I felt a steady quietness in my chest, the kind that doesn't ask for applause. Then one morning, I received a final message from Greg. It was short, typed, almost mechanical. "I saw the article about the scholarship. I hope you're happy." I read it twice, smiled faintly, and wrote back, "I am. I hope someday you understand what that word really means." I didn't expect a reply, and none came. In the weeks that followed, the air grew colder, the bakery's windows fogged each morning, and I found a new rhythm to my solitude. Sometimes people confuse peace with absence, but it isn't that. Peace is presence without fear. I began spending my evenings at the hospice again, reading aloud to patients who couldn't sleep. Once, one of them asked, "Do you have children?" I hesitated only a moment before answering, "I do, but life taught us to love each other from a distance." The woman smiled faintly, and I realized that was the most honest thing I'd said in years. The climax of my life, if that's what this was, didn't end with noise or reconciliation. It ended in stillness, in an act that no one could undo or claim, an act that rewrote my own history from one of servitude to one of authorship. I understood, finally, that power isn't what you take from others. It's what you stop giving away. That night, before I went to bed, I stood by the window looking down at the quiet street. The lights in the bakery below were still on. Emilia was sweeping the floor, humming to herself. I pressed my hand against the glass, felt the coolness seep through my skin, and whispered, half to Tom, half to myself, "We did it. We left something good behind." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They settled into the room like a prayer fulfilled. The winter that followed was long and mercifully uneventful, the kind of season that teaches you the meaning of endurance not through struggle, but through quiet repetition. The mornings began earlier each day as the sun retreated, and I found a kind of comfort in the rituals that had replaced my old chaos. The hiss of the kettle, the soft creak of the wooden floors, the first scent of bread rising in the bakery below. My life had narrowed into something simple, contained, and strangely abundant. I no longer checked my phone expecting messages from Greg. At first, that silence had stung, as if each unanswered day were an accusation. But slowly, it turned into a kind of rhythm, the steady absence of noise that lets you finally hear yourself think. I didn't hate him anymore. I didn't even pity him. I simply understood that what we had between us was not broken so much as complete, like a book whose final page had been written, and all that remained was the closing of its cover. Sometimes, though, the past found small ways to knock on the door. One morning, a letter arrived from Kieran, my eldest grandchild. It wasn't long, just a few paragraphs written in a hesitant, uneven hand. But it carried more sincerity than anything I'd received from his father in years. He wrote that he had seen the article about the scholarship, that he was proud, that some of his classmates at university had talked about applying. He ended the letter with a line that nearly undid me. "I think what you did was brave, Grandma. I hope I can be like you when I'm older. Someone who doesn't just talk about doing the right thing, but actually does it." I read that sentence over and over, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to cry. Not from grief, but from the strange relief of being understood, even briefly, by someone who hadn't been there for any of the battles, but somehow knew how much they had cost. After that letter, something in me softened. I began sending small notes to the grandchildren, birthday cards, recipes, the occasional photograph of the bakery cat sprawled in the sun. I didn't expect answers, and yet sometimes they came. Simple replies with emojis and little stories about school. There was no talk of Greg or Allison, no attempt at mediation, just the tentative, fragile correspondence between generations trying to remember each other without the clutter of resentment. I realized that reconciliation, when it comes, rarely arrives through apology. It arrives through continuation, through the quiet persistence of affection unburdened by explanation. By February, the Scholarship Foundation had started its second year. Clara sent me quarterly reports that I read like love letters, numbers and names that together formed a portrait of something alive and growing beyond me. The first recipients had written notes of thanks, and one of them, a young woman named Sophia, visited the bakery one morning to meet me in person. She was small, serious, with the kind of calm determination that reminded me of my younger self. She thanked me with an earnestness that made me both proud and shy. "You gave me a chance," she said, and I wanted to tell her that she had no idea what she had given me in return. The sense that my life's quiet work, the long years of invisible labor and patience, had finally turned into something visible. Something with its own heartbeat. That evening, after she left, I sat by the window and watched the snow begin to fall. The street below was almost empty, the bakery lights glowing soft amber through the fog. I thought of Tom again, of his steady hands, of how he used to hum when sanding wood, lost in the rhythm of making something from nothing. For the first time in decades, I felt that same rhythm inside me. The noise of regret had faded, and what remained was a hum of peace so deep it felt like music. I realized that forgiveness isn't something you give to those who wronged you. It's something you grant yourself when you finally stop rehearsing the injury. One evening, as I was closing the curtains, I caught sight of a man standing across the street. It took me a moment to recognize Greg. He was alone, his shoulders hunched, his breath visible in the cold air. He didn't try to cross or wave. He just stood there for a few seconds, looking up at my window, then turned and walked away. I didn't move. I simply stood there, watching him disappear into the winter dusk, a tall, fading shadow swallowed by the quiet. I didn't feel the urge to chase him or call his name. There are goodbyes that happen not in words, but in the gentle acceptance that the story has already done what it came to do. I closed the curtains and let the moment settle like dust, light, and final. The rest of the season passed in slow beauty. I turned 75 that March. Emilia and her husband closed the bakery for an hour to host a small party in my honor. There were candles and music from an old radio, and someone brought a chocolate cake so rich it made everyone laugh with guilt. When they sang, I didn't make a wish. I didn't need to. The wish had already come true in ways I hadn't known how to imagine when all of this began. Later, after everyone had left and the lights were dimmed, Emilia handed me a wrapped box. Inside was a small wooden plaque engraved with the words, "You are not broke. You are whole." I traced the letters with my fingers, smiling at how something that had once been a wound had turned into a truth I could hold without pain. As spring approached, the city began to thaw, and so did I. I started walking again in the park near the river, the same one I had avoided when I still felt the weight of humiliation. The trees were bare but full of promise, the way all living things are before they bloom. Sometimes I'd see mothers pushing strollers, young couples arguing softly, teenagers sprawled on benches with their music too loud. Life continued, unaware of me, and that was the greatest kindness it could offer. I had spent too many years measuring my worth through the gaze of others. Now I could finally exist without needing to be witnessed. On the first warm day of April, I opened all the windows in my apartment and let the smell of the bakery fill the rooms. I made tea and sat at the table where the old papers used to lie. Contracts, statements, arguments reduced to ink and dates. That table had seen every version of me, the fearful, the compliant, the angry, the resolute. Now it held only sunlight and the slow drift of steam from my cup. I thought about how, in the end, nothing extraordinary had happened. No revenge, no reconciliation, no miracle, just a woman deciding finally to live on her own terms. That, I realized, was the miracle. Before bed, I wrote one last letter, addressed not to anyone in particular, but to the women who might someday find themselves where I once stood, torn between love and self-respect, between duty and freedom. I wrote, "Do not let them measure your worth by what you give away. Save something for yourself, your peace, your name, your breath. You are allowed to end the story before it ends you." I sealed the letter and placed it inside the old ledger, the one that had once tracked every penny. Let it balance something greater now, I thought. That night, as the city settled into sleep, I lay in bed and felt no fear of time passing, no dread of the years still to come. The silence was full, the kind of silence that belongs only to those who have finished explaining themselves. Outside, the bakery lights went out one by one, and in the dark, I whispered to the room, to Tom, to no one and everyone at once. I am not broke. I am finally paid in full.